The thing about children is that they know when someone really sees them. Not the polite, performative looking over that adults do. The quick scan to confirm that yes, a child is present and accounted for. No visible emergency. Carry on. Emma Walsh had experienced plenty of that kind. She'd been looked at by social workers who checked boxes and moved on. She'd been looked at by teachers who noticed her quiet and filed it away under shy. She'd been looked at by the Higgins family during their meet and greet, their eyes warm with manufactured welcome, and she'd known even then, at 9 years old, that those eyes were performing something rather than meaning it. But Mike Donovan had looked at her. That was 30 seconds, maybe less, outside the pump and go on Route 9, on a blinding Tuesday afternoon in late August when the heat rose from the asphalt in visible waves and Emma had been sent to stand by the car while Dale filled the tank. 30 seconds where a man the size of a refrigerator, wearing a leather vest covered in patches she couldn't quite read, had crouched down to her level in the parking lot and said, in a voice like gravel rolling around the inside of a tin drum, "Hey kiddo, you all right?" She'd almost said yes. It was the automatic response, the one worn smooth by months of practice. "Yes, sir. I'm fine, sir. Everything's great, sir." The words were already forming in her mouth when he looked at her arm, the right one, which she'd been holding slightly away from her body because it still ached where Dale had grabbed her the night before, grabbed and twisted because she'd knocked over a glass of water. Just water, not even something that stained. And his eyes did something she had never seen adult eyes do before. They went very, very still. Not angry, not shocked, not the complicated, retreating expression adults wore when they suspected something but didn't want to be responsible for knowing it. Just still, present, like he was giving her his full attention and had decided that nothing else in the world mattered as much as the next few seconds. "You sure you're all right?" he said again, softer this time. Emma looked over her shoulder. Dale was arguing with the credit card reader on the gas pump, his back to her, his irritation already building in the set of his shoulders. Sandra was in the passenger seat, fanning herself with a magazine. Nobody was watching. Emma looked back at the big man with the leather vest. "Not really," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Too small, honest words that she had not said out loud to anyone since before she could remember. "Not really." He nodded, like that was the bravest thing he'd heard all year. He reached into the breast pocket of his vest and produced a business card, plain card stock, slightly worn at the corners, with a phone number handwritten on the back in thick black ink. He pressed it into her palm with a gentleness that seemed physically impossible from hands that size. "My name's Mike," he said. "If you ever really need help, not maybe help, not someday help, but right now help, you call that number. Anytime, day or night." "Okay." Emma closed her fingers around the card. "Okay," she whispered. Dale's voice cut across the parking lot. "Emma, get in the car." She got in the car. She held the card so tightly on the drive home that the number pressed temporary red indentations into her palm. She would need it sooner than she thought. The house at 14 Mercer Street looked fine from the outside. This was, Emma had come to understand, the whole point. It was a two-story colonial in a neighborhood of two-story colonials, with a tidy front yard and a mailbox shaped like a covered wagon that Dale had purchased from a craft fair and was inexplicably proud of. The gutters were clean. The welcome mat said "Bless this home" in faded letters. In the driveway sat Dale's Ford F-150 and Sandra's Honda Odyssey, both washed and presentable. The flower beds were weeded. Emma was responsible for that. Inside was a different architecture entirely. Emma had been placed with the Higginses 7 months ago, in January, when the state of New Jersey had finally accepted that her previous placement wasn't working out. Not working out was the careful, bureaucratic language for a situation that had involved 3 different school nurses and 2 incident reports that somehow never made it to the right desk. She'd arrived at Mercer Street with a single rolling suitcase and a backpack, and Sandra had exclaimed over how pretty she was, and Dale had shaken her hand with the firm grip of a man who wanted you to know he was in charge, and Emma had thought, with the ancient, weary part of her that had been evaluating adults for most of her conscious life, "I have seen this before." She had not been wrong. The abuse at the Higgins house was not the explosive, obvious kind that left evidence, or not often. Dale and Sandra were too smart for that, or too experienced with the system. It was the grinding, cumulative kind. The meals withheld as punishment, the sleep deprivation from being kept up until midnight to clean things that were already clean, the cold silences that stretched for days, the words delivered in reasonable, even tones that nevertheless stripped something away every time. You're more trouble than you're worth. Nobody actually wanted you. You know that, right? This is charity. You should be grateful. Physical incidents happened, but they were calibrated. A grab too tight. A push that could be called accidental. A slap across the face that Sandra would later describe, should anyone ask, as a firm correction. Nothing that couldn't be explained. Nothing that left marks for long. Emma was a smart girl. She understood the system she was in with the weary, practical intelligence of a child who has had to understand systems in order to survive them. She knew that her caseworker, a woman named Janet Morse, visited once a month and spent approximately 45 minutes in the living room drinking Sandra's coffee and checking her boxes. She knew that Dale and Sandra had been licensed foster parents for 11 years and had a spotless record with the agency, partly because they were careful and partly because children in the system learned quickly that reporting things rarely helped and sometimes made them significantly worse. She had discovered sometime around age 7, the kind of person who remembered things, numbers, dates, exact words spoken in exact tones on specific occasions. The way Dale's shoulders sat when he was genuinely calm versus performing calm. The difference between Sandra's real laugh and the one she used in public. The precise layout of every room, every exit, every window that could be opened from the inside. She stored all of it in an internal cabinet she'd built over years of needing to be prepared. She tucked the card into a small zippered pouch inside her backpack, between a library card and a folded drawing of a horse she'd made in 2nd grade and carried everywhere for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She took it out sometimes at night when the house was quiet, held it in the dark, read the number by the faint orange glow from the streetlight outside her window. She didn't call. Not yet. Instead, she did research. The patches on his vest, she'd glimpsed them, but she had an artist's eye and a good memory. The most prominent one had said Hell's Angels in an arc with something in the middle she couldn't recall precisely. She looked it up at the school library, typed carefully into the search bar, and found images that matched. She read about the club with the focused attention of someone trying to understand whether a tool was safe to use. What she found was complicated. This was not an organization of friendly neighborhood volunteers. They had a long and difficult history, one that adults discussed with a combination of fear and grudging respect. There were things they had done that were not good. There were chapters that had been investigated for serious things. But there were also other stories, scattered across forums and news articles, harder to find but undeniably there. Chapters that had organized protection for children in danger. Women and kids who had called for help and received it in the form of motorcycles filling a street. Bikers who showed up at the homes of abusers and stood there, quietly, until something changed. She filed this information in the cabinet under potentially useful. She waited. The waiting got harder as January became February became spring. As Dale's temper ran hotter with the warming weather. As Sandra's casual cruelties became more creative, more targeted, finding the specific things that would land in the specific ways that left no marks anyone could document. As Emma learned to sleep lightly and move quietly and always know where the exits were. She turned 9 in April. Sandra made a birthday cake from a box mix and took a photo for the agency records and then ate most of it herself while watching television. Dale didn't acknowledge the day at all. Emma sat on her bed that night and held the card for a long time, tracing the numbers with her thumb. Not yet, she told herself. But soon. Let me back up, because you need the full story of that afternoon in August. Actually, it begins 3 months before the gas station. It begins on a May afternoon when Emma was in the backyard of 14 Mercer Street, weeding the garden as punishment for some infraction she no longer remembered clearly, and she heard it, the sound of motorcycles. Not one, a lot of them. She stood up. She wasn't supposed to stand up while weeding. Dale had been explicit, you stay bent over the flower beds until the job was done, and looked over the fence that separated the Higgins property from the alley running behind Mercer Street. A long column of motorcycles was rolling past, maybe 20 of them, their engines a deep communal thunder that she felt in her sternum. The riders wore leather vests. Some had passengers. They rode in a loose formation, unhurried, owning the alley. One of them glanced over at her as he passed. A large man, very large, with a gray-streaked beard and forearms that looked like bridge cables, moving too fast for any real exchange. But he caught her eye and gave her a single nod. A brief acknowledgement. "I see you, kid." And then they were past, the sound fading, and Emma was alone in the backyard with her weeding gloves on and a strange feeling in her chest she would have called, if asked, the specific ache of knowing something good exists somewhere in the world and being very far from it. She went back to weeding. She didn't think much about it until 3 months later, when Dale stopped at the pump and go on Route 9 on the way back from a trip to the hardware store, and Emma got out to use the bathroom and walked around the corner of the building into a parking lot crowded with motorcycles. At least 15 of them, big machines, chrome and leather, some custom painted, all of them suggesting enormous power held temporarily at rest. Their riders were scattered around the lot, some standing by their bikes, some sitting on coolers, a few gathered around a folding table at the far end. They were large men, mostly, loud in the way of people who don't need to perform comfort in their own company. They laughed easily and often, an unself-conscious kind of laughter that Emma had not heard much of. She stopped walking. She was paying very careful attention. "You need the bathroom. It's around back." The voice came from her left. She turned to find a man sitting on the bumper of a truck, a can of soda in his hand, watching her with calm, assessing eyes. He was the largest man she had ever seen in person, not in a frightening way, in the way of something like a draft horse, something built for sustained power and endurance. Gray beard, close-cropped, eyes that were kind in a way that contradicted the overall impression of solidity. "Thank you," Emma said. She had learned to be economical with adults she didn't know. She used the bathroom. She came back out. She was walking back toward the front of the building when she heard Dale's voice from the other side of the wall, telling Sandra that if the machine didn't take the card, he was going to lose his mind, and Sandra's voice agreeing that everything in this state was broken, and Emma slowed down without quite deciding to. Big Mike was still sitting on his truck bumper. He was looking at her arm. She became aware of it the way you become aware of something you've been carefully not thinking about. Her right arm, still tender and slightly swollen, held at a careful angle all day. She had thought she was concealing it adequately, apparently not from everyone. And then the 30 seconds happened, as already described, as she would describe them to a counselor 6 months later, and again to a judge a year after that, always with the same precision, because she remembered things. His name was Mike Donovan. She didn't know that yet. She knew she had his number on a piece of cardstock in her closed fist, that he had looked at her like she was worth seeing, and that Dale was calling her name from the front of the building. She got in the car. She didn't say a word on the drive home. But that night, in her room, she tucked the card into her zippered pouch and lay on her back looking at the ceiling and thought, for the first time in a long time, something that resembled hope. "Now I have something." She called him 2 weeks after the gas station. Not because of an emergency, because she needed to know if the number was real. She used the school phone during lunch, told the secretary she needed to call her caseworker about a form, which was plausible enough that nobody questioned it. She dialed the number. It rang twice. Yeah, his voice, unmistakably. Even through a phone line it had that quality, that ground-level rumble. "This is Emma," she said. "You gave me your number at a gas station. Route 9, pump and go, late August." A brief pause. Emma. And she could hear him remembering, could hear the shift, something moving from baseline alertness to specific attention. "Right arm. Mid-August." "Yes." "I'm glad you called." No hesitation. No surprise. No trace of inconvenience. For words, and she believed every one of them. "You okay right now? You safe?" "I'm at school," she said. "I'm okay right now." "Okay. Good. You can call me whenever you want. You understand that? Not just emergencies. Just to talk. Just to check in. Whenever." "Okay. Okay," Emma said. And then, because something in his voice made her feel she could, "Your vest had patches on it." A low rumbling sound that she realized after a moment was laughter. "Yeah, it did. I looked them up." "Did you?" "Hell's Angels. New Jersey chapter." That's right. She thought about everything she'd read. The complicated history. The other stories. The code she didn't fully understand. "Are you actually going to help if I call?" she said. "Or was it just something you said to a kid to make her feel better?" A long pause. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Emma, I've been in this club for 28 years. In 28 years, I have said exactly 4 times to a child in trouble that I would help if they called. All 4 times, I helped. He paused again. You would be the 5th. She let out a slow breath. Okay, she said. I'll call if I need to. You do that. She hung up, handed the phone back to the secretary with a thank you, and walked back to the cafeteria. Externally, nothing had changed. Internally, Emma Walsh had done something seismic. She had allowed herself, for the first time in a long time, to believe that someone was actually there. Over the following weeks, they talked 3 more times. Always from the school phone, always during the window when the secretary was at lunch. Each call lasted 5 to 10 minutes. Emma told him more than she'd intended to. Not the specific incidents she kept carefully to herself, but the texture of life at Mercer Street. The coldness of it. The way the house felt like a held breath waiting to become something worse. Mike mostly listened. He asked careful questions. He didn't say that sounds terrible or you poor thing. Didn't offer any of the expressions that would have made Emma feel like a subject being discussed rather than a person being heard. Instead, he asked, do you have somewhere to go if you need to get out of the house fast? And is there a neighbor you trust? And do they ever leave you alone? And if so, for how long? He was assessing the situation with professional thoroughness. He was filing information. Emma recognized the process because she used it herself. He told her some things too, small pieces offered with matter-of-fact simplicity. He had a daughter, grown now, lived in Portland. He'd been married once, wasn't anymore. He'd grown up in Newark, started riding at 17, been with the club since 22. He liked boxing and terrible action movies and cooking, actual cooking. You cook, Emma said, the 3rd time they talked. Why is that surprising? I don't know. You're large. That laugh again, a low, rumbling landslide. Large people eat a lot, Emma. It follows that some of us learn to cook. She laughed too. It felt strange and good, like a door opening into a room that had been locked for a long time. There's a guy in my club, Mike said, name of Tommy. We call him Torch, not because he's an arsonist, before you ask. It's because he welded custom exhaust for 10 years and has the burn scars to prove it. Torch makes the best enchiladas you have ever tasted in your life. I mean it. Men could have had a restaurant. Instead, he rides motorcycles and intimidates people. That's a waste, Emma said. That's exactly what I tell him. She hung up after that call and sat through the rest of her afternoon classes. Math, science, gym, and through all of it she carried the calls like a small warm thing in her pocket, something to put her hand on when everything else was cold. She didn't call again for 3 weeks. And then September arrived, and everything accelerated toward the point where things break. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Emma had made a logistical mistake, the kind that a child shouldn't have to calculate, but that children in certain households learn to calculate constantly. She had left the card in her backpack's outer pocket instead of transferring it to her jacket lining before Dale inspected her things, which he did sometimes, randomly, to keep her off balance. It was a control mechanism she had identified and cataloged months ago. She had simply miscalculated today. Dale found it during a bag check while Emma was setting the table for dinner. He brought it downstairs to the kitchen holding it between 2 fingers, like evidence. Sandra was unloading groceries. Dale set the card on the counter and called for Emma in his quiet voice. Not the shouting voice, the very quiet one, which was somehow worse. Emma came downstairs. Both of them were looking at her with an expression she had learned to dread, the one where they were deciding how to weaponize something. What's this? Dale said. Emma looked at the card, the number in thick black ink. She'd already memorized it, had memorized it within the first week, but seeing it on their kitchen counter was like seeing something private exposed to fluorescent light. A phone number, she said. Whose phone number? She considered her options in approximately 2 seconds. Lying. Risky. Dale was good at pulling threads. Silence. Worse, he interpreted it as defiance. The truth, framed simply. A man I met, she said. He said if I needed help, I could call. Dale and Sandra exchanged a look. And then Sandra did something more devastating than anger would have been. She laughed. It was a bright, contemptuous sound, precisely targeted. A man you met, she repeated, in the voice she used to make Emma's statements sound childish. Emma. Honey, you know you're not supposed to talk to strangers. He saw my arm and... Oh, Emma. Sandra set down her grocery bag and turned to face her fully, with the terrible warmth of someone who has chosen condescension over fury. You made up an imaginary friend, didn't you? A big, strong man who would come rescue you. She tilted her head. Is that it? He isn't imaginary, Emma said. Her voice was perfectly flat. Right. Dale picked up the card and turned it over. Plain cardstock. No letterhead, no company name. Just a handwritten number. Some giant biker hero is just waiting for your call. His tone was mock thoughtful, the kind he used when he was enjoying himself. What's his name? Your knight in leather armor. Mike, Emma said. His name is Mike. Mike the biker. Sandra turned to Dale, and they were both smiling now. The synchronized smile of two people who had always had each other when everyone else was against them. I can just picture it. Emma calls her imaginary motorcycle man, and he swoops in on his white stallion, and she made a vague, dismissive gesture. What? Saves the day. Yes, Emma said. Quietly. Steadily. Without flinching. Dale's smile narrowed. He didn't like that. He didn't like the stillness in her voice, the fact that she wasn't crumbling into defense or tears. He looked at the card once more, then slid it across the counter and off the edge into the trash can beneath the counter overhang. Emma watched it fall. Dinner's at 6, Sandra said, turning back to the groceries. Table's set. Yes, Emma said. Good. Emma completed setting the table. She ate dinner. She washed her plate. She went upstairs, and she did not say another word for the rest of the evening. But the number was memorized. It had always been memorized. She lay on her bed that night and looked at the ceiling and understood that something had crystallized. The card in the trash made concrete something that had been theoretical. They had taken the number away because they thought it was nothing, because they thought she was nothing. No resources, no connections, no one on the other end of a phone she wasn't permitted to use. She turned the number over in her mind the way she used to turn the card over in her fingers. They laughed, she thought. They always underestimated children. They always forgot that children listened and watched and remembered and waited. 3 weeks later, on a Friday night in October, things broke. They broke the way things that have been under sustained pressure for a long time finally break. Not dramatically, not with one clear precipitating event, but with the sudden exhaustion of every structure that had been holding them in place. A week of bad temper from Dale, who had lost money on something he wouldn't discuss. 3 days of Sandra's particular cold silence. A school conference where Emma's teacher had mentioned, carefully, that Emma seemed withdrawn and she wondered if everything was okay at home, and Dale had smiled his reasonable smile, and Sandra had touched Emma's shoulder with false maternal warmth and said she was just a bit shy. Always has been. But the drive home after had been terrible in the specific, measured way that Dale's punishments always were. By Friday, Emma was running on less than 4 hours of sleep, because the night before Dale had kept her up until 2 in the morning reorganizing the garage. Every box down from the shelves. Every item cataloged and replaced. Under the halogen work lights with the garage door closed. Just the two of them, the whole neighborhood asleep. Near the end, she'd set a box down wrong, and a jar of screws had fallen and scattered across the concrete floor. And Dale had. The point was that her arm hurt again. The other one this time. By Friday, she had run out of the particular quality of careful compliance she used as armor, and at dinner, she dropped a serving spoon. Just dropped it. Her fingers slipped, and the clatter of metal on kitchen tile was like a starting gun. What followed is not worth documenting in precise detail. Some things don't need to be detailed to be understood. It is enough to say. There was shouting, and then there was Dale pushing her against the kitchen wall, and then there was Sandra not stopping it and not leaving the room, and then there was Emma on the kitchen floor with both of them standing over her. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Emma made a decision. She made it with the calm, analytical part of her brain that had been watching and assessing for 7 months. The part that had listened to Mike's careful questions about exits and neighbors and windows and timing. The part that had been filing contingency plans while the rest of her managed the daily business of surviving. The decision, now? She waited for the exact right window, Dale's attention pulled by Sandra saying something, both of them talking over each other, the specific 3-second gap of redirect that happens sometimes during these episodes. And Emma was on her feet and through the kitchen door and up the stairs and into her room with the door closed and locked in under 8 seconds. Dale's footsteps on the stairs. The door handle tried. His voice, low and measured through the wood. Open this door. Right now. I'm going to call someone, Emma said. A pause. You don't have anyone to call. I have one person, she said. Another pause. She could hear him deciding. Hear the calculation in the silence, the weighing of escalation against exposure. "You don't have your phone," Sandra called from downstairs. "We have your phone." This was true. Emma did not have a phone. What Emma had was the same thing she'd always had. The number, memorized, and the knowledge, carefully verified weeks ago, during one of her small, systematic surveys of the house, that there was a landline, old-fashioned and barely used, mounted on the wall in the upstairs hallway, just outside her door. It was a calculated risk, a significant one. She unlocked her door. Dale was right there, and for one terrible second she thought she'd misjudged the timing. But she was small and fast, and she was already moving, already past him and to the phone on the wall, already dialing before his surprise finished becoming reaction. 7 digits. She had run them through her mind 1,000 times. It rang once. "Yeah, Mike." Her voice was not steady anymore. Something had given way in it, some structural element she'd been holding in place for months. "It's Emma. Where are you?" Already different. The operational register, immediate and focused. 14 Mercer Street, Raritan, the house with the covered wagon mailbox. Dale's hand came down on the phone cradle. The line went dead. Emma looked at him. He looked at her. Then Sandra appeared at the top of the stairs and said, quietly, "Get her in the room. We'll deal with it later." It was the word later, the way they talked about what would happen to her, as if she weren't standing right there, that settled everything into a strange, cold clarity. Dale steered Emma back toward her room. She went. She let herself be steered. She went into her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She looked at the window. She breathed. She waited. The call had lasted 11 seconds. She had given him an address and one identifying detail. New Jersey was understood from their conversations. 11 seconds might not be enough. She did not know how far away he was, or whether he was at home or somewhere else, or whether he would bring other people or come alone, or whether she had been wrong about all of it, whether it had always just been a card from a stranger who said something kind once in a parking lot, and nothing more. She sat on the bed. She looked at the window. She breathed. She waited. She heard them before she saw them. At first she thought it was one motorcycle, just one, growing from distant to close. And she felt her heart do something complicated that might have been hope, or might have been the specific grief of hope being wrong. One motorcycle was not enough. One man was not enough. She had calculated this against everything she knew about Dale, who was a large man with a volatile temper, and she had found this during the garage reorganization and filed it in her mental cabinet, a shotgun in a locked case under the driver's seat of his truck. But then the sound multiplied. It did not double or triple. It became something else entirely. It became a vibration, a physical presence she could feel in the floorboards under her feet, in the glass of her window, in her own ribcage. It was a sound that did not ask permission, did not apologize for itself, announced its arrival with the full confidence of something that has no anxiety about what it's arriving to. She went to the window. Mercer Street on an ordinary Friday night in October had the mild, domesticated quiet of a residential neighborhood. Porch lights on. A dog barking 3 houses down. Orange sodium glow from the streetlights. And then they turned onto the street. Emma counted. She lost count at 15 and stopped trying. They filled the street, a column of headlights rolling in slow, deliberate procession, and they rolled to a stop in front of 14 Mercer Street and cut their engines simultaneously. A coordinated silence that was somehow louder than the noise had been. More than 20, maybe closer to 30. She couldn't tell from the window. In front, on a motorcycle that was mostly black with minimal chrome, sat a large man with a gray beard who dismounted with the unhurried ease of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. He stood in the street and looked up at the house. He looked up at her window. The light in her room was off. The glass would be reflecting the streetlights back at him. He probably couldn't see her. He looked at her window anyway, with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what they came for. And then, though she was probably imagining it, probably projecting it onto a face she could barely make out in the dark, he nodded. She pressed her hand flat against the glass. Downstairs, Dale said, "What the?" Mike Donovan had received Emma's call at 8:47 p.m. He'd been at the chapter house in Bound Brook, 14 miles from Raritan, at the end of a long meeting about club logistics he would not bore anyone with. He'd heard her voice break. that specific quality of a person who has been holding something together for a very long time finally losing their grip on it. And he had been in motion before the call disconnected. He hadn't needed to say much to the room. "I've got a kid in trouble." That was enough. It had always been enough. Tommy Reyes had been on his feet by the time Mike was through the door. Behind Tommy, Dom Castellano, the sergeant-at-arms, built like a load-bearing wall and twice as dependable. Ray Preach Mitchell, vice president, who had 3 kids of his own and a particular, deeply personal hatred of a specific category of wrongdoing. Danny Ortega, the newest prospect, barely 20, who had seen enough in his own life to have formed strong opinions on the subject without needing to articulate them. And others, more of them, filing out into the parking lot, finding their keys, starting engines. Not because Mike asked, because they heard what he said and they knew what it meant. 14 miles, 20 minutes at the speed limit. Not because they drove fast, they drove exactly the speed limit, the whole column of them. But because 14 miles when you know what you're going toward doesn't feel like very far at all. Dale Higgins opened the front door at 9:16 p.m. He opened it because a motorcycle had pulled into his driveway, and someone had knocked, a single firm knock, and because he was the kind of man who was used to being the most intimidating thing in any room, and therefore did not consider the possibility that this calculation might occasionally be wrong. Mike Donovan was standing on the welcome mat that said "Bless this home." Behind Mike, Mercer Street was full. Motorcycles in both directions, filling both lanes, still arriving. Riders standing or sitting in postures of relaxed, patient stillness. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had her porch light on. The neighbors on the left had come to their front window. Dale's jaw worked. "Help you?" Mike looked at him for a long moment. His expression was pleasant. Somehow this was worse than anger would have been. "Emma called me," he said. His voice was conversational. "I'm Mike. She may have mentioned me." Dale's face moved through several calculations very quickly. "Emma doesn't have any. I know what you thought," Mike said. He looked at the door. He looked at Dale. His hands were at his sides. Everything about him was calm. "I'd like to see her." "You don't have any right to." "I'd like to see her," Mike said again. Same tone. Same patience. The patience of a man who has decided he has all the time in the world and does not need to raise his voice to make clear that things are about to change. Behind him, the street was very full of people who were very, very quiet. Sandra called the police. This was actually fine. This was what Mike had been hoping for. The Raritan Borough Police arrived at 9:31 p.m., 1 cruiser, then quickly 2 more, to find a residential street containing approximately 27 motorcycles, their riders distributed in postures of elaborately casual patience. And at the center of it a situation that Officer Patricia Chun would later describe in her report as unlike anything in her 12 years on the force. Mike Donovan knew of Patricia Chun, not personally, professionally, tangentially, through channels. She had a reputation for being thorough and for not letting things slide when she knew something was wrong. He had been counting on exactly that. She went inside. She found Emma Walsh sitting at the top of the stairs with her knees drawn up to her chest, having come out of her room when she heard the police arrive and sat there, listening, the way she had been listening to everything in this house for 7 months. Patricia Chun was 34 years old and had a daughter herself and had seen things in 12 years on the force that she could never entirely set down. She looked at Emma Walsh for approximately 2 seconds. That was enough. "Hi," she said, her voice very careful and very warm. "Can you come down and talk to me?" Emma came down. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she dropped the serving spoon, the marks of the evening still visible in the pushed-back chairs and the spoon on the floor, and she told Officer Chin things she had never told anyone. Specific things, dates she had kept track of, because she was the kind of person who kept track. The night in the garage, the steps she had been pushed down in a way that was called losing her footing, the meals used as punishment, the exact words spoken in the quiet voice on specific occasions. She taught for a long time. Patricia Chin wrote everything down without interrupting, without expressing disbelief, without using any of the deflecting phrases that Emma had learned to expect from adults who were presented with uncomfortable information. Dale and Sandra Higgins were arrested at 10:15 p.m. Dale, it should be noted, attempted to argue. He stood in his living room and spoke about rights and procedures and 11 years of service to the community in a reasonable voice right up until the moment Patricia Chun read him his rights. at which point the reasonable voice stopped working entirely and something else came out, something that removed any remaining ambiguity about what kind of man he was and what the inside of 14 Mercer Street had actually been. Sandra began crying. She was still crying when the second cruiser took her. The covered wagon mailbox stood in the front yard, lit by police lights, looking entirely ordinary. Emma Walsh stood on the sidewalk at approximately 10:30 p.m., wrapped in a police department jacket 4 sizes too large, watching the activity around her with the particular stillness of a person who has been in motion on the inside for so long that the sudden stopping feels disorienting and strange. Mike Donovan came and stood next to her, not close enough to crowd her, just nearby. "Present. You okay?" he said. She thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about everything. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the most honest answer I have." He nodded. "That's fair." They stood there. From down the street, she could hear the other riders talking in low voices, the easy sound of people who are somewhere they chose to be. Tommy Reyes was sitting on the curb talking to a young officer who appeared to be processing something at some distance from his professional training. A few neighbors were outside now, having the over-the-fence conversations that happen when a street becomes a scene. "I memorized the number," Emma said, after they threw the card away. "I memorized it months ago." Mike looked at her. Something moved in his face. "I know," he said. "You know? I figured that's what you would have done." He said it simply, like it was obvious. Like her resourcefulness was an expected feature rather than a thing to be remarked upon. "I figured you'd been keeping it in your head." She looked up at him. He was very tall from this angle. The patches on his vest were readable now, close up, in the police lights. Hell's Angels. New Jersey. Chapter designation. Other patches she didn't know yet. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "I know. But," she stopped, tried again. It still felt like it might not be real, even when I was dialing. It felt like maybe I'd been wrong, and nobody would pick up. Mike was quiet for a moment. Then, "People have let you down enough times that you built in the expectation of it." "Yes. That makes sense." He looked at the house. The lights on in every window now, the activity. "We're going to work on making that expectation wrong." She didn't say anything to that. She looked at the street full of motorcycles instead. "There are a lot of them," she said. "Yeah, there are." "Did they all come because of me?" He was quiet for a beat. "They came because a kid needed help, and one of ours said so." He glanced down at her. "That's how it works." Emma Walsh, 9 years old. A kid who had spent a very long time not expecting things, who had built careful internal systems to manage the specific weight of being let down by the people responsible for her, looked at 27 motorcycles that had ridden 14 miles to fill a street for her, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not the calculated, contingency-laden version of hope that she'd allowed herself, the useful hope, the hope that was really just planning. Something underneath that, something simpler and more frightening in its simplicity. She felt like she was worth it, not performing worth it, not calculating whether she deserved things. Just the plain, cellular certainty that she existed and that there were people in the world who had demonstrated, concretely, unmistakably, with their physical presence on her street on a Friday night in October, that they would show up. She didn't cry. She was not a child who cried easily. She just stood on the sidewalk in the too big jacket and breathed. The months that followed were not simple. They were complicated and procedural, and sometimes painful in different ways. The ways that systems are painful even when they're finally trying to function. There were hearings and reports and reviews and 2 journalists who somehow found out about the motorcycle club and the little girl and the covered wagon mailbox and tried to write stories about it, only to find that approximately 28 people had developed sudden, collective, comprehensive amnesia about the specifics of that Friday evening, which was not technically obstructing justice and which Mike found quietly satisfying. Emma was placed in an emergency foster situation. A woman named Gloria Reyes, no relation to Tommy, she verified this immediately, who had a quiet house in Somerville, 3 cats named after jazz musicians, and a gift for steadiness that expressed itself in the simplest possible ways. Actual meals at actual times, a room with a door that locked from the inside, a schedule that was kept, a voice that did not change based on her mood. She met with a counselor named Dr. Frank Osei who wore excellent sweaters and had a patience that seemed genuinely bottomless. She talked about things she had never talked about. She learned some words for what had happened, and some words for what she was feeling now that it had stopped, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that having words for things helped more than she would have predicted. Language was a tool. She had always been good with tools. She called Mike every Sunday evening. From the basic smartphone Gloria had provided, 7 o'clock, 20 minutes or so, sometimes 30 when Tommy had done something worth reporting. He told her about the club, about cases he'd seen come right, about Preach's kids who were apparently producing a noise level that had become a community discussion. She told him about the cats, about Dr. Osei's sweaters, about her new school where there was an art teacher who had noticed Emma's drawings and had things to say about them that were specific and useful. He came to visit on a Saturday in November, just him and Tommy, no bikes, an unremarkable pickup truck, and unremarkable jackets. And they took her to a taco place and let her order 3 different things and ask every question she'd been accumulating. "Do you have family?" she asked Tommy Reyes, who was indeed quite large and indeed bore the burn scars she'd read about, but who had eyes that smiled independently of the rest of his face, which was a feature she had decided she trusted. "Mother, 3 sisters, 2 nieces," Tommy said. "Full house. My mom does Sunday dinner every week. Everyone comes, no exceptions. First time I missed one, she drove to the chapter house and knocked on the door herself." He paused. That was a thing. Were people scared of her? Little bit, yeah. Emma considered her second taco. "Do you think she'd mind if one more person came to Sunday dinner sometime?" Tommy looked at Mike. Mike looked at his food with the careful attention of a man saying nothing on purpose. "No," Tommy said, after a moment, with the precision of someone meaning exactly what they say. "No, I really don't think she'd mind at all." Dale and Sandra Higgins pled guilty in January of the following year. The plea included mandatory program completion, which both of them failed to complete. They lost their foster care license permanently. Their record was flagged in every system that mattered. They would never be responsible for another child. Emma did not attend the hearing. She knew the outcome. That was enough. The review that followed of the foster care system, of case management protocols, of what had and hadn't been documented and why, resulted in significant changes at the agency level and some at the state level. Janet Morse, Emma's former caseworker, became to her genuine credit one of the most vocal advocates for those changes. This was partly atonement and partly, Emma suspected, because Janet Morse had looked at what she'd missed and decided she was going to be someone different going forward. Emma did not have strong feelings about Janet Morse. She had a limited amount of emotional energy, and she preferred to use it on things that were directly in front of her. Emma turned 10 in April. The birthday party was at Rosa Reyes's house in Bound Brook. Rosa Reyes was 4'11", 62 years old, had immigrated from Guadalajara 38 years ago, and had formed an opinion about Emma Walsh in approximately 45 seconds the first time Tommy brought her to Sunday dinner in December. The opinion was, "This one is mine now. She just doesn't know it yet." Rosa had not articulated this out loud, but she had begun feeding Emma with the specific, targeted care of someone who has made a decision and is executing on it quietly and with full commitment. The birthday cake had been a 4-Sunday project. Rosa had asked Emma what her favorite flavor was. Emma had said she didn't know. She'd never really paid attention to that. Rosa had expressed the appropriate degree of consternation at this information and immediately converted it into a series of baking experiments: chocolate, red velvet, carrot cake, and finally, on the 4th Sunday, lemon vanilla with cream cheese frosting, which Emma had eaten 2 pieces of and looked at Rosa and nodded once, seriously. "That one," her expression said. "That one." Rosa understood. The party filled the backyard in the way that Rosa's events always filled whatever space they occupied, completely, warmly, without particular regard for the original size of the space. Tommy's 3 sisters came with their families. Preach Mitchell and his kids, who were close to Emma's age. Dom Castellano, who spoke rarely but had arrived with a gift wrapped in careful brown paper that turned out to be a professional quality watercolor set, because Dom had heard Emma say once, in passing, that she liked drawing, and Dom was the kind of person who filed things away and acted on them later. Danny Ortega, who had become Emma's friend in the specific, uncomplicated way that young people sometimes befriend each other when they recognize something similar in each other's eyes. Officer Patricia Chun came off duty with her 8-year-old daughter Lily, and the 2 girls found each other within 10 minutes and spent the rest of the afternoon in the corner of the yard talking about horses with the focused seriousness of a professional symposium. And Gloria Reyes, the foster mother, stood in Rosa's kitchen with Rosa for most of the party, and nobody interrupted them. And both of them came out looking purposeful in the way that people look when something has been decided. Emma didn't know, on that afternoon, about the paperwork already in motion. She didn't know about the conversations that had been had between Gloria and the agency, and between Gloria and her own lawyer, and between Rosa, who was not officially involved in anything, but was involved in everything. She didn't know what Gloria had said in the kitchen, or what Rosa had said back, or what the particular expression on Gloria's face meant when she looked at Emma across the backyard. She would find out in June. She would find out on a Tuesday evening at Gloria's kitchen table over pasta, when Gloria set down her fork and said, carefully and precisely, "I want you to stay, Emma. I want to make that official, if you want it. But only if you want it. It's your choice." Emma would think about it for 3 days. She would talk to Dr. Osei about it, and call Mike about it on Sunday, and sit with it alone for a long time. And then she would go back to Gloria's kitchen table and say yes. But that was June, on her 10th birthday, in the backyard of a woman who had made a 3-layer lemon vanilla cake, because she had spent 4 Sundays figuring out the exact right thing. Emma Walsh was not thinking about the future at all. She was thinking about right now, the warm April afternoon, the noise of people who had nothing to perform, the cake, which was perfectly the right flavor. Across the yard, Big Mike was in a lawn chair with his 3rd piece of cake, not apologizing for it. He looked up and caught her eye from across the noise and the people and the afternoon light. He raised his fork. "I see you, kid." Emma raised her hand back, and then Lily Chun grabbed her by the wrist and said, "Come on, you have to see what we found under the rose bushes," and Emma turned and went, because there was a thing to see and someone to see it with, and the afternoon was warm and long and full of people. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in fact, the whole thing. The thing about children is that they know when someone really sees them. Emma Walsh had learned, by 10 years old, the specific weight of being managed and processed and looked at without being seen. She had learned to survive that weight by building herself into someone who watched and calculated and remembered and kept phone numbers in her head. But she had also learned, and this, she came to believe, was the more important lesson, that there are people in the world who will look at you like you are worth looking at, who will hand you a number and mean every word of it, who will start their engines at 8:47 p.m. on a Friday and ride 14 miles because one of theirs said a kid needs help. She had learned that sometimes systems fail and structures break and the forms don't reach the right desk. And she had learned that sometimes, when systems fail, the front door bursts open. And on the other side is someone who said they'd come. And they came.